Morning. Say, we've been working on our good mornings this semester, and we're doing so much better. So much better. If this is your first time with us in a while this morning here at Life Point, or if you're watching online, we're on week 4 of a 7-week series in which we're looking at the question of just exactly who is this Jesus that so defines who we are, individuals and families, and as a church. Who is this Jesus that we wear around our necks and wear on our t-shirts and post on our Instagram feeds? And in so doing, we're looking specifically at the beginning of the Gospel of John. And this morning we're looking at John chapter 6 and Jesus' feeding of crowd of a few thousand. But before we go there this morning, will you join me in going to the Lord in prayer? And if I might ask that today in your prayers, if you are a woman in the congregation this morning, I'm not winking at you. And if you're a gentleman, I'm not giving you the stink eye. I have an infection in my eye. And so if you've been looking at and saying, what is wrong with Ben's face? I've got a little infection this morning, so you can keep me in your prayers this morning as well. But let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, as we got to see one of our own come before you and come before the body this morning and say, identify me with Jesus. From this point forward, don't identify me at my core as an American. Don't identify me as a Minnesotan. Don't even identify me as a member of my immediate family. Identify me with Jesus. What a beautiful thing. This morning, may we identify just a little bit stronger, a little bit deeper with you. In your precious and holy name we pray this morning. Have you ever felt like you just didn't have the right tools for the job? In my home, I am renowned for getting elbows deep in a job and only then realizing that I didn't have the right tool or tools for the job. And so it's only when I'm perched on top of a dining room chair holding up a living room fan, or only after I've squeezed my rather significant body under my wife's van, only then do I realize that the tool that I need to get the job done is not with me. And at best, I've left that tool in my toolbox in the garage, but at worst, that tool is sitting at Home Depot waiting for me to go and buy it. I think more than anything else in the whole spectrum of fix-it scenarios, I hate the little screws. Now, not the big screws, not the screws that are big enough that when you realize you don't have the right tool, you can, rather than sending your children to go rifle through the garage, you can ask them for something like a butter knife and it'll kind of do the job. No, those are the big screws. I'm talking about the tiny screws where you're sitting on Christmas morning trying to put together a toy that looks and feels like it was designed by a robot with 6 arms. And you've got 9 little springs and 4 plastic doors and 13 little tiny screws that all have to be put in to exactly the right spot at exactly the same time. And what you want to do is just super glue the whole thing together and tell your child, I don't know what happened. If you're a parent in the room, you've been there. If you're a grandparent in the room, you're so glad you're not there anymore. Or what about cooking? Have you ever gotten into a recipe and it's sitting on the pot and you realize, I don't have what I need. I don't have what the recipe calls for. Honey, I know that we have told the kids that we're having spaghetti and meatballs for dinner, and they're so excited, but we just don't have spaghetti. But we have ramen. And we also don't have meatballs, but we have hot dogs. Spaghetti and hot dogs, you know. Those of you who have worked in the construction industry know that one area you don't want to go swapping materials is in that of construction. You don't want to swap out what you're building with. For instance, throughout the Gospels, Jesus frequently uses the illustration of building with sand as an example of a really unwise decision. I know up here in Minnesota, have you had the experience of sitting on a beach surrounded by your children with sand working its way into every crevice that you have, desperately trying to build a sand castle? If you haven't, let me just tell you that sand, well, if what you're looking for is something that is a pile of dirt that looks like Paris after World War II, then sand is exactly what you want to build with. But if you care about what it looks like or that it lasts, generally for most people, sand is just not going to be your building material of choice. But that's for the majority of us. Actually, in the hands of a master, even sand can be used to build some pretty significant marvels. Check this out.
Every year, the Baltic Sea island of Rügen holds its annual Sand Sculptures Festival, which draws artists from the world over to create and show off their skills at working with sand. And in 2019, a new world record was set for the tallest sandcastle ever to have been made. It took almost a month to build and was inspired by the Game of Thrones, with a dragon along the base and wrapping around the turrets. A team of 12 sculptors and 8 technicians worked 8 hours a day for 3.5 weeks to bring the design to life, which saw them mixing 11,000 tons of sand with water to create the perfect material to sculpt. And amazingly, this castle has no other form of support structure other than the wet sand. The sand was specially imported from the Netherlands to ensure that it had the perfect qualities needed for the feat, and it had to be compacted with water under high pressure and transported to the site in large trucks. Sculptura Projects, the organization behind the castle, had actually tried to set the record on 2 previous occasions before this success. The first one collapsed 3 days before it had been due to be completed, while the second one had to be canceled because a species of rare bird had set up a nest in the remains of the previous year's attempt. The third time was the charm for them, and the completed design had a circular base that was 85 feet and 3 inches in diameter, and the officially recognized height was measured to be 57 feet and 11 inches, a full 3 feet taller than the previous record holder. It was finished in June and planned to remain in place for the summer until November, with $10 tickets available for tourists and visitors to go look at the castle and speak with those who were involved in building it.
58 feet tall. In the hands of a master, even sand can be used to create a masterpiece. Last week, we looked at the story of Jesus healing a lame man in John chapter 5, and we talked about how Jesus doesn't want to help us accomplish what he has given us to do. Jesus wants us to step aside and allow him to transform us and to transform the world around us. This morning we jump into John chapter 6, and as we do so, we're going to see that when Jesus handles his business, he always does very high quality work. Regardless of what's brought to him to work with, we never see Jesus doing shoddy work. Let's take a look this morning at our passage from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. If you have a Bible, you can turn with me. If not, feel free to look at the screen. Reading from the New International Version, John 6, 1 through 14 says this: "Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It'd take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to even have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves and gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves that left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus had performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world." This is one of those few Jesus stories that appears in all 4 gospel narratives. And because this story appears in all 4, and because in each narrative the story is told in a slightly different way, through looking at all 4 narratives simultaneously, we get a more complete picture of what took place on this day. We find in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, that sometime after the healing of the lame man at the pool, remember that we've talked about this several times throughout this series, that in the book of John, in the Gospel of John, John's primary concern is not chronology. He organizes his thoughts topically, and so we don't know, as with all of these stories, we don't know exactly when in Jesus' life and ministry this occurs, but we know that sometime after his healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, that Jesus crosses over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And when he arrives at the other side, Jesus goes up into the hill country. Some of your Bibles might say the mountainside or a hill. He goes up into the hilly country and sits down with his disciples. And by this time, Jesus had developed quite a reputation, and everywhere that Jesus went, crowds gathered. And so when the people of the area had discovered where Jesus had landed and where Jesus had gone, they began to flock to him. And verse 5 of John 6 tells us that when Jesus looked up and saw people coming to him, he went down to the mountainside to meet them. In the Gospel of Matthew, where this account occurs, Matthew adds that Jesus, when he looked up, he had compassion on the crowds. And so he takes time that perhaps even he needed for himself to spend time with the Father, with his disciples, and he has compassion on the crowds, and he goes down to meet them. And then Jesus poses this question to Philip: "Where should we buy bread for these people to eat?" We don't know why Jesus poses this question to Philip. The text doesn't tell us that. Perhaps Philip was from the area and might know of a good town to buy bread in. Or perhaps Jesus just knew that Philip needed some additional testing of his faith, as we see at other parts in the gospel narratives. But we do know that Jesus asked this question to test Philip and the other disciples, because the latter part of verse 5 tells us that Jesus already knew what he was going to do. Nevertheless, regardless of why Jesus chose to test Philip in this way, if the test is one of whether or not Philip would lean in, we've been talking about leaning into Jesus and leaning into his challenges. If this is about leaning in to trusting Jesus' power and ability, then we'd have to conclude that Philip fails miserably, because when asked where they might buy bread, Philip responds quite simply, "That's not going to happen. That's impossible, Lord." And not because there wasn't anywhere to buy bread, but because to do so was just more costly than they could handle. I see so much of myself in Philip here. Jesus poses a question of how we might tackle something that Jesus decides is worth tackling. And my immediate response is, that's just impossible, Lord. There aren't the resources. There isn't the money. There aren't the people. It just can't be done. And the way that Philip words his response betrays that in his mind, there wasn't even enough resources to do a bad job. Jesus asks Philip, where might we buy bread to feed these people? And Philip responds, there isn't even enough. We couldn't even buy enough that everyone could have a single bite. While the passage here in John gives us the impression that this statement of Philip and the next one of Andrew's all occur within the same conversation, in the other gospel accounts, specifically in the Gospel of Luke, we find that actually the better part of the day occurs in between these two verses. We find that Jesus leaves Philip to consider his question and Philip's own response to it, and Jesus goes down and begins to teach the people about the kingdom of God and to heal those who needed healing. Again, remember that Jesus looks up and has compassion on the people. However, as the day wore on and as they got closer to evening, the disciples came to Jesus and asked him to send the people away so that they might go to the surrounding villages and buy something to eat. And then Jesus responds by instructing the disciples, you give them something to eat. Again, Jesus gives his disciples a chance to trust in his amazing transformative power. And again, the disciples fail the test. They respond, perhaps even sarcastically, shall we go and buy bread for 200 denarii and give it to them to eat? A denarii was approximately 1 day's wage for one person. And so 200 denarii would have been roughly equivalent to half a year's wages for one person. In their answer, we see perhaps that the disciples actually did have enough in their coffers to cover just such a purchase, but they challenge Jesus on his wisdom in spending so much money on something that they saw to be such a wasteful endeavor. I don't know about you, but again, I see myself in the disciples. Jesus lays out a vision and perhaps even provides the resources for accomplishing that vision, and I find myself questioning whether that is the right use of those resources. I hate to tell you, but you have a very foolish pastor. So often, I think that I know better than Jesus. So often, I think that I can make better, wiser choices than what God has revealed. Again, in the Gospel of Mark, we find Jesus giving the disciples one more chance to pass this test of faith. Jesus asks them, well, how many bread cakes do you have? The word for bread here is the word artos. It means it means a little pancake, not pancake in the way that we think of what a pancake is, but a little cake that you would cook in a pan, almost like a tortilla. It was a very common meal for people of this time. Jesus asks them, how many bread cakes do you have? Here Jesus gets the disciples off of the mental track of thinking about money and asks them to look around at what resources they have available. In verses 8 and 9, we see that Andrew has come upon a boy seemingly who is willing to give up his own personal food that he's brought for the cause. This boy has 5 bread cakes and 2 fish. Now, on the one hand, it's perhaps a bit commendable to Andrew that he doesn't just completely pass over this little bit of food, and he does recognize this as a potential resource and brings it to Jesus. But we still see a distinct lack of understanding in Andrew's response to Jesus. But how far will this little bit go among so many? 3 times here. 3 times we see Jesus giving his disciples an opportunity to lean in, an opportunity to trust that if Jesus says, you know what, let's feed these people, that he has the ability to feed them. Despite what appears to be the case, despite the lack of financial resources, despite the enormous amount of need, despite the seeming lack of physical resources, if Jesus says, let's do this, he has the ability to follow through. 3 times, Jesus gives them an opportunity to lean into that reality, and 3 times they respond with, it's just too big. The need is just too big. And so Jesus gives the disciples one last opportunity to respond in obedience. Almost like training wheels opportunity to respond in faith. Jesus instructs them simply to have the people sit down. In the Gospel of Mark, we see Jesus instructing them to sit down specifically in groups of 100 and then in groups of 50. Essentially what Jesus is doing is he's saying, prepare the people for a meal. Over and over, Jesus had given the disciples an opportunity to lean in. Finally, without ever verbally criticizing them for their lack of faith, Jesus simply tells them to make preparations for him to do what he does, to just get the job done. And then finally, in verse 11 of John 6, we see what probably is the reason for what John writes in 4, that this was around the time of the Jewish festival. As John looks back on this memory, he sees Jesus doing with these people the same thing that Jesus does a number of months or years later with his disciples at the Last Supper. He takes this bread and he breaks it and he thanks God for it, and then he gives it. The word here that John uses is the word Eucharisto, from which we get the Eucharist. Now, the word literally, it really means nothing more than to give thanks. But it's the same word here in John chapter 6 that John uses in the story of the Last Supper to describe what Jesus does. Because in both of these stories, Jesus takes something mundane, something normal, something that under normal circumstances could never be sufficient for the need, for the job, something like a small chunk of bread. And then Jesus thanks God for it, and then he makes it sufficient. Wow. Finally, in verses 12 and 13, we see that after everyone had eaten their fill, there were enough bread chunks left over for 12 baskets of bread chunks. The word blessing, I love this. The word blessing literally means to have what you need plus some. Let's sit on that for a moment. To be blessed means to have your needs met plus anything beyond that. The disciples really honestly believed. Their confidence was in that this need, this job that Jesus had set aside, when this was done, there wasn't going to be, not only was there not going to be anything left, there wasn't enough to get the job done. And in the way that Jesus so often does, he responds by doing such good work that after everyone had eaten their fill, there was enough left over for every single one of those disciples to go home with a take-home dish. Let me ask you this morning, what is it that Jesus is laying in front of you that you don't possibly see how this is going to work? What is it that Jesus is asking you to lay at his feet, hoping that you will give over to him what really already belongs to him? What is it that you're grasping onto because you feel that to let go of it would result in you not having what you need? Are you grasping onto the little free time that you have, pushing back against Jesus as he challenges you to take on a role of servanthood or leadership? Are you grasping onto financial resources that you have and pushing you back against Jesus as he challenges you to give to help accomplish his work here or elsewhere? Are you grasping onto your own preferences for what life should be like, or what church should be like, or what family should be like, or what retirement should be like, and pushing back against Jesus as he challenges you to let go of your own preferences and let him give you all that you need plus some? I find it significant that both here in John 6 and also in almost every story of Jesus working a miracle, he always takes something sacrificed and transforms it into something incredible. We almost never see Jesus creating from scratch. The Father creates from scratch. The Father breathes creation out of nothing, but Jesus doesn't. We don't see that. I will say, we don't see it much. Honestly, I can't think of an instance where we see it at all, where Jesus creates from nothing. What we see is Jesus taking something sacrificed and transforming it into something miraculous. Here in John 6, we see that the sacrifice that Jesus is choosing to work with is that of the young boy. In this day, it was very common for people to only eat one meal a day. That would have been the norm for most of the population, is that one meal a day was what you got. And the vast majority of the time, that meal was going to be nothing more than bread. There's an idea within scholarship that when the Acts of the Apostles talks about when the people of God gathered together to share a meal, they also shared communion. They shared the Lord's Supper, because so often the meal was bread and then either water, or where water was not available, wine, because wine kept longer than water. So often bread was what you had. That was the meal. And so however this boy came to have 5 cakes and 2 fish, and however he came to be a part of the crowd, it's likely that when he offered his 5 cakes and 2 fish, what he was offering was his meal for the day. And in a time in history in which, when there wasn't enough food to eat, it was very normal for the men to be fed, and then if there was food left over, then the women and the children. In such a day and such a time in history, it is entirely reasonable for us to assume that when this boy gave over his meal, that he was giving over his only meal for the day with no reasonable explanation that he would get to share in it. And as I think about how this boy gave in such a way that it cost him something, I am so convicted that so much of what I bring to Jesus is out of my extra. After all of my own needs and the needs of my family are met. Whatever's left over, Jesus, you can have that. Would you allow me to say this morning, I don't think Jesus wants your scraps. Don't get me wrong, Jesus can take whatever is brought to him and transform it into a masterpiece, but so often in the scriptures, when we see Jesus doing that, he's using something sacrificed, something that costs something. Yes, at the end of our story, we see the disciples not having to spend their 200 denarii to buy bread for the crowds. And yet, I can't help thinking that as the disciples look back this story, these events, and perhaps even as they're writing them to go into their gospel accounts, that they're lamenting and they're wondering, that was a missed opportunity. What an opportunity we missed to bring something to Jesus and watch him turn it into a miracle. Now, the little boy, on the other hand, how cool would it be for him to get to spend the rest of his life telling his kids and his grandkids, hey, did I ever tell you that story about the time Jesus fed thousands with what he found in my lunchbox? This morning, as our musicians come and prepare to lead us in our closing song, let me ask you, what is it that Jesus is challenging you to let go of? What is it that Jesus is challenging you to sacrifice? Is it pride? Is it your own self-interest? Is it your preferences, your perspectives? Does Jesus want you to let go of resentment towards someone? Does Jesus want you to let go of fear about the future? What is it this morning that Jesus is saying to you quite simply, let go? And as we worship together, will you respond in obedience this morning?